Hi everyone. Yesterday, during the reading of Torah portion Bo, I lifted up this book, which is written backwards, as it seems in the video, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. It's a book by Alfred Edersheim, a man who was born into an Orthodox Jewish family, and they converted when he was about 8 to the Anglican Church in the late 1800s. But at the time, he was considered the foremost authority on the Jewish world, I guess in the eyes of Christian scholarship anyways. So what I've decided to do is I'm just going to read the book and discuss it with anybody who happens to hop on the live stream and talk about it. But I'm using my headphones today for the first time, so I'm not sure how well it's working. So let me pause it just 1 second and see how the video is going. Of Christian scholarship, anyways. So what I've decided to do is I'm just going to read the book and discuss it with anybody who happens to hop on. Nothing like hearing yourself echoed. It looks like the video feed is using the microphone built into the phone, so I'll just won't even worry about the headphones. And if anybody notices any different when I pull them out, please let me know. Alright, chapter 1. The Jewish world in the days of Christ, and the Jewish dispersion into the East. Among the outward means by which the religion of Israel was preserved, one of the most important was the centralization and localization of its worship in Jerusalem. If to some the ordinances of the Old Testament may in this respect seem narrow and exclusive, it is at least doubtful whether, without such a provision, monotheism itself could have continued as a creed or a worship. In the view of the state of the ancient world and of the tendencies of Israel during the earlier stages of their history, the strictest isolation was necessary in order to preserve the religion of the Old Testament from that mixture with foreign elements which would speedily have proved fatal to its existence. And if one source of that danger had ceased after 70 years' exile in Babylonia, the dispersion of the greater part of the nation among those whose manners and civilizations would necessarily influence them rendered the continuance of this separation of as a great importance as before. In this respect, even traditionalism had its mission and use as a hedge around the law to render its infringement of modification impossible. So that's the first paragraph in the book. Basically, the point he's trying to make is it's never been easy in the course of history, as we read in the Bible. It seems that it's very difficult for monotheism to persist. That's the belief in a one God system. Most of the ancient world believed in multiple gods, whether it was in Egypt or in Greece or Rome or Babylonia, or even among the Persians. Now they did at the end tend to favor Zoroastrianism. But there's still some multiple God ideas in there. I mean, even in the Muslim world, there's the multiple God ideas of the three daughters of Allah, which is mentioned in the satanic verses. What he's trying to explain is basically that Israel is kind of hanging on and introducing the concept to a world that is not receptive to the idea of not only an invisible God who you can't see because you can't build an idol of him and sit there and worship it, but a God whose influence is basically just his word, and if you happen to catch a miracle happen, then you get to see that aspect of it too. But what it boils down to is he's saying that Israel from its beginning, we see the time of the judges, right? After they enter into the Holy Land, everyone spent 40 years in the wilderness, being conditioned and trained. Then they get into the Holy Land, and within just a few generations, everything is starting to become difficult for the nation. Because the tribes that are in the north They don't want to have to go all the way down to the south to help the southern tribes. The southern tribes are down there dealing with stuff coming up from Sinai, and then the northern tribes dealing with stuff coming up from Phoenicia, and the Philistines are down in the south, and they keep bumping into the southern tribes. Northern tribes don't want to deal with it, etc., etc. And you have to see the institution of the judges to actually bring the people together. There's a famous story of the, I can't remember exactly where in Judges it is, but it's a story of a priest and his young female, a slave girl, who he gives to a mob of Benjamites who basically rape her to death. And the next morning she manages to crawl her way to the threshold of a man's house and grab the threshold of his home. And at that point he's like, well, now I have to reconcile what's happened to this girl. And he chops her up into pieces and sends one piece over to each of the 12 tribes, or the tribes that aren't Benjamin, and says, this is what they have done to this girl. If you do not come and support me, this is what I will come and do to you. And that's one of the judges of Israel. Basically, it's hard to keep the system of the law working when you got people spread all out, and there's no rapid form of communication, etc., etc., and no centralized structure of power. Because without a king, you don't have anybody that can come and hit you over the head and say, you better do what I say, or I'm going to, execute you and your whole family. You don't see that happening when you have a loosely associated group of people who are trying to live under the same law together. Once they move into the time of the kings, it takes 3 kings to destroy Israel. Saul is the one that people picked. David's the one that Jehovah picked. And David's son Solomon is the one who ended up destroying the kingdom because of his, not only the fact that he married women from every tribe you can think of, but he brought all their gods into the temple too. And I believe it was the prophet Nathan that came to him and said, it's over. God's taking the kingdom from you, but he will leave you with Judah because he loves David, because of the love he had for David. And that's when Jeroboam was given the 12 northern tribes. And on both sides, it didn't matter. Neither of them did the right thing. Solomon had every god, and then Jeroboam immediately sets up the golden calf system and tries to keep the money that would be going down to Jerusalem up in his part of the kingdom. So what he's saying in this book in the very first paragraph is, it's a miracle that you even know who the Jews are and that monotheism even exists. It's everything about the history of what happened in Israel should have ended it, should have destroyed it. Ahab and Jezebel brought in good old-fashioned straight up Baal worship right out of Tyre. You see then the appearance of Elijah, who basically goes to bat and says, nope, this can't stand. We can't let this stand. And over time you see the kingdom steadily fall apart. Assyria takes the north, Babylonia takes the south. They go into exile for 70 years in Babylonia. And there, you got to understand, it wasn't like Nebuchadnezzar put them in slave irons and turned them all into slaves. Nebuchadnezzar took the smartest, the most educated, the best off, wealthiest, middle class, artisan type people from Jerusalem, brought them back to Babylon and said, become Babylonians. I'll give you a section to live in, and you guys become Babylonians and you start being my people. And for a lot of people, that's what they did. If 1 million people went into Babylon, 50,000 left to return when Ezra and Nehemiah start happening. And when they did, they had to make some hard concessions, because when Nehemiah the priest got up, when they got up and they said, we're going to go back, but we're going to keep the law. That means all of you who have married a Babylonian woman or have children with a Babylonian woman, you must leave them behind. And because it's inappropriate for the priesthood to marry, a woman outside of the tribes. And at that point, some of them did. They swore the oath, and they abandoned their children and their wives in Babylon, and they returned to Israel. But again, that's only a small percentage of the whole number that left originally. And that's why Alfred Edersheim is saying it's a literal miracle that monotheism exists, or that we even know who these people are. And of course, by the time you get into the Greeks, conquering Israel. Alexander the Great comes in. They surrender the city of Jerusalem to him. Then after he dies, very shortly thereafter, because he didn't live to but just his early 30s, he when he lived, sorry, got a little message there. He didn't live past his early 30s, and his 4 generals carved up his kingdom and made it into 4 separate provincial governments. Israel was taken initially by Ptolemy, and then was conquered by the Seleucid kings, and that's where Antiochus, goes in, and you see the War of the Maccabees. Point being is the only reason the War of the Maccabees could happen was because a lot of Jews had no trouble with Hellenistic thought and bringing it into logic and reason. These are the tenets of Greek thought. It's what we call Western thought nowadays. They were bringing in mathematics and logic and reason and geometry and saying, hey, you need to let go of the old superstitions of your past, and you need to come to understand the new way of understanding reality, which is based on logic instead of based on whatever your gods told you. So they go, and a lot of people didn't have a problem getting along with the ideas that the Greeks were bringing to them, basically saying, well, what we'll do is we'll eat the fish and we'll spit out the bones. The part of the Greek culture we like, we'll keep. The part we don't like, we won't use, And a lot of people were taking like that, but there were a few who were like, no, we cannot let any of that come into our way of life. Next thing you know, we'll be worshiping many gods. Next thing you know, the temple will be a temple of, Jupiter Olympus, which is exactly what happened to it. He turned it into Antiochus, but not just by himself. I mean, he had to receive backing from the people in the city. That is to say, turn off my screens there. That is to say, he needed support of the local officials and the government. I mean, yes, you can do a lot with an army, but unless you camp them out constantly and turn them into some kind of giant police force, which you'd have to pay for the whole time, you have to get cooperation of the people, and there was. And the Maccabean revolt was in large part a civil war between Jews who were faithful to the Orthodox ideas and Jews who wanted to indoctrinate into the more Greek mindset. And that continued all the way into the time of Christ, because the Hasmonean kings didn't have any problem being Hellenized, and the last 2 of them, who actually ended up making Israel into a vassal state of Rome, went to the Roman went to a Roman magistrate in the city of Pompeii to get their judgment concerning which of the 2 of these brothers should be the quote-unquote king. I think the actual title is ethnarch of Israel. And of course the Roman magistrate said, well, which of you sides with Rome? And the one that said, I side with Rome, is the one who was made king. It didn't last long, though, because when Augustus Caesar became Caesar, he immediately got rid of the Hasmonean dynasty and replaced it with Herod the Great, and that's where we get King Herod the Great from. He was an Edomite who was in the Hasmonean court, and he was made friend of Caesar, and he became what he referred to himself as King of the Jews. But again, that's all Edersheim's saying is, it is a literal miracle that we even have any of this stuff still, because so many kingdoms, so many people, so many religions have risen and fallen, or been warped and molded into things that are completely unrecognizable from where they start, that it's just unbelievable that we have a monotheistic religion that has persevered and even become most religions now are monotheistic, at least in the West, with the idea of Christianity, even if you believe in a Trinity doctrine, still it's a monotheistic religion. Islam's a monotheistic religion, and so is Judaism. So let's continue on to the second chapter. Wherever a Roman, a Greek, or an Asiatic might wander, he could take his gods with him, or find rites kindred to his own. It was far otherwise with the Jew. He had only one temple, and that in Jerusalem, only one God, him who had once throned between the cherubim, he who was still king over Zion. The temple was the only place where a God-appointed, pure priesthood could offer acceptable sacrifices, whether for forgiveness of sin or for fellowship with God. Here in the impenetrable gloom of the innermost sanctuary, which the high priest alone might enter once a year for the most solemn expiation, had stood the ark, the leader of the people into the land of promise, and the footstool upon which the Shekinah had rested. From this golden altar rose the sweet cloud of incense, symbol of Israel's accepted prayers, and the seven-branched candlestick shed its perpetual light, indicative of the brightness of God's covenant presence. On that table where, before the face of Jehovah, was laid week by week the bread of the face, a constant sacrificial meal which Israel offered unto God, and wherefore God in turn fed his chosen priesthood. On the great gold-sprinkled altar of sacrifice smoked the daily and festive burnt offerings, brought by all Israel and for all Israel wherever scattered, and the festive while the vast courts of the temple were thronged not only by native Palestinians, but literally by Jews out of every nation under heaven. Around this temple gathered the sacred memories of the past. To it clung the yet brighter hopes of a future, and the history of Israel with all the prospects intertwined in their religion, so that it might be said that without their religion they had no history, and without their history they had no religion. Thus, history, patriotism, religion, and hope alike pointed to the Jerusalem and to the temple at the center of Israel's unity. So he's saying that the temple in Israel was everything to the people. The Pharisees, about 70 years prior, and I guess around 70 BC, had cut a deal with a Greek queen and had her make it into law that all Jews in the kingdom that was ruled by that particular family were required to sacrifice a half shekel a year for the purpose of paying for offerings for the poor and for restoration of the temple, etc., etc. They called it like a redemption. They based it off the idea of Moses saying, you need to pay this redemption price for yourself. And because they had got that instituted by law, they were actually able to prosecute people and take the property from people who did not pay the 2 drachma tax or the half shekel tax, which may in fact be why Yeshua said, "You who plunder widows' houses," referring to them as people who, through the use of law, have figured out not only how to get themselves paid out of the temple treasury, which they did. Rabbis were paid from the half shekel tax that was collected by the temple. If you were a teacher, then you got to get a portion of that money for your synagogues and stuff, and to get yourself paid. But in the same token, that money made the temple a fabulously wealthy, trophy piece in the Middle East. It was the kind of place that everybody knew there was a tremendous amount of wealth. They would send merchant caravans loaded with silver and gold, or I guess probably silver shekels, right? Or at least money of whatever type they were using. They would send armored caravans from around the Middle East and all the way west from Spain to deliver the half shekel tax to Jerusalem. So it had an incredible influx of money for religious reasons, even though it was not a big trade city itself. Galilee was where the trade was. Let's see. Nor could the depressed state of the nation alter their views or shake their confidence. What mattered it that the Idumean, Herod is referring to Herod, he's an Idumean, had usurped the throne of David, except so far as his own guilt and their present subjection were concerned. Israel had passed through deeper waters and stood triumphant on the other shore. For centuries, seemingly hopeless bondsmen in Egypt, they had not only been delivered, but had raised the God-inspired morning song of Jubilee, as they looked back upon the sea cleft for them, and which had buried their oppressors in their might and in their pride. Again, for weary years had their captives hung Zion's harps by the rivers of that city and empire, whose colossal grandeur, wherever they turned, must have carried to its scattered strangers the desolate feelings of utter hopelessness. Yet that empire had crumbled into dust, while Israel had again taken root and sprung up. And now, little more than a century and a half had passed since a danger greater than any that these had threatened the faith before and the very existence of Israel. In this daring madness, the Syrian king, Antiochus IV, or Epiphanes, had forbidden their religion, sought to destroy their sacred books, with an unsparing ferocity forced on them conformity to heathen rites, desecrated the temple by dedicating it to Zeus Olympus, and even reared a heathen upon the altar of burnt offerings. Worst of all, this wicked scheme had been aided by two apostate high priests, who had outviewed each other in buying and then prostituting the sacred office of God's anointed. Yet far away in the mountains of Ephraim, God had raised for them most unlooked for and unlikely a help. Only 3 years later, and after a series of brilliant victories by undisciplined men over the flower of the Syrian army, Judas the Maccabee, truly God's hammer, had purified the temple and restored its altar on the very same day on which the abomination of desolation, referred to in 1 Maccabees 1:54, had been set up to its place. In all their history, the darkest hour of their night had been preceded the dawn of a morning brighter than any that had yet broken. It was thus that with one voice all their prophets had bidden them to wait and hope. Their sayings had been more than fulfilled as regarding the past, and they would not equally become true in reference to that far more glorious future for Zion and for Israel, which was to be ushered in the coming of the Messiah? ? Nor were such feelings of the Palestinian Jews alone. These indeed were now a minority. The majority of the nation constituted what is known as the dispersion, or the diaspora, a term which, however, no longer expressed its original meaning of banishment by the judgment of God, since absence from Palestine was now entirely voluntary, but all the more than it referred to not to outright suffering, did it continue to use and indicate a feeling of religious sorrow, a social isolation, and of a political strangership in the midst of a heathen world. For although, as Josephus reminded his countrymen in the Wars of the Jews, chapter 2, verse 16:4, there was, quote, no nation in the world which had not among them some part of the Jewish people, since it was widely dispersed all over the world and among its inhabitants. This is from the Wars of the Jews. Yet they had nowhere found a real home. A century and a half before our error comes to us from Egypt, where the Jews possessed exceptional privileges, professedly from the heathen, but really from the Jewish Sibyl, this lament of Israel. And this is the quote, song. Crowding with thy numbers every ocean and country, yet an offense to all around thy presence and customs. So basically what he's saying there is that even though Jews, there was no forbiddance for Jews to come and live in Israel again, or Palestine, or the land between the Nile and the Euphrates. But so many weren't living there. So many chose to live in other nations, other countries, and yet called themselves, Jews wherever they went. And in most of these nations and countries, their customs and practices were considered an offense. Because, for instance, the Romans tended to call the Jews lazy because they wouldn't work on the Sabbath. And they were like, that's just a lazy people because they won't work. If they would work, they wouldn't have these problems that they have. That's one of the ways the Romans would look at it. And you can imagine being in other countries like Gaul or the Gaelic or the pre-German areas. There were people who were Celtic there, and they had completely different customs and traditions, and their calendar was a solar calendar, and a lot of them eventually became Christian under Arianism. But all in all, the Jewish life, even though they were all in all these places, they still tended to live separately from the common, quote-unquote, common people, and they tended to live in Jewish enclaves. And I mean, even today, you see a lot of Jewish people live near other Jewish people, even though they consider themselves not even religious. Like, for instance, there's a website, JDate, because Jews typically do not marry non-Jews. They usually marry other Jews, and they look to date other Jews, even when they're not religious. Even when they don't consider themselves religious, they're still looking to be within their own tribe. 60 years later, the Greek geographer and historian Strabo bears the like witness to their presence in every land, but in language that shows how true had been the complaint of the Sibyl. The reasons for this state of feeling will by and by appear. Suffice it for the present that all unconsciously Philo tells its deepest ground, and that in Israel's loneliness in the heathen world, when speaking, like the others, of his countrymen as, and this is Philo speaking, all the cities of Europe, in the provinces of Asia and in the islands, he describes them as wherever sojourning, referring to the Jews, having but one true metropolis, not Alexandria, not Antioch, not Rome, but the holy city with its temple dedicated to the Most High God, a nation, the vast majority of which was dispersed over the whole inhabited earth, had ceased to be a majority, ceased to be special, and had become a world nation. Yet its heart beat in Jerusalem, and thence the lifeblood passed to its most distant members. And this, indeed, if we are rightly to understand it, was the grand object of the Jewish dispersion throughout the world. So he's reiterating the idea that even at the time, Jews who were not living in Israel understood that they had kind of voluntarily dispersed themselves throughout the nations instead of returning to the place that was basically the heart of being Jewish. And this, you see this among Jews today too, as they refer to the, there's several different sects that are commonly referred to. You have Reformed Jews who, they might do Christmas hams and Easter egg hunts and stuff like that. You have the conservative Jews who don't believe a lot of what's actually, they don't keep the practices of the Torah, but they do keep a lot of the practices of the rabbinical side of stuff. And then of course you have your Orthodox, your ultra Orthodox, and your Hasidut, or the Hasidic Judaism, which is what you think of as a very very Torah observant people, but also very observant of the different writings of the rabbinical literature, the Talmud, the Gemara, the study of Gematria, the Zohar, all to differing degrees of how seriously they take what's written there. But basically, he's just reiterating that even at the time, these folks knew that Jerusalem was the heart and soul of who they were as a people, even though a lot of them didn't want to live there. They didn't want to live in Israel. But like I said, because the Pharisees had required it, they still had to send money to Jerusalem. They still had to pay to help build that temple. And if you read in Deuteronomy 12:12, I believe it says, if it's too far to make the journey for the festival, then you can eat the sacrifice in the gate where you are, but you need to send the holy things to the holy place. And as I mentioned, they would send, huge caravans filled with treasure, and obviously heavily armored and with heavily armed guards, across land bridges and across the Mediterranean, and come from the east, across Persia, what we call Iran and stuff today, that they would be sending their tribute to the temple for the purpose of building it. And if you ever read, and if this is the last Edersheim book I've got left that I haven't read, and it's I loaned out my other copies to people who I wanted to get interested in learning more. And I had a copy of the Temple and its Ministries, and it's a great, easy to read book that's just packed full of stuff about what was going on at the temple at the time. The way in which you dealt with the priests, the way in which sacrifice was taken care of, all that type of stuff. And it's fascinating. And of course, you can download most of it. You don't have to buy these books. They're printed in the 1800s. There's no copyright on them. You can download most of them from online libraries of different schools, like I think the Wesleyan School, which I guess is related to Wesley, from the Methodist Wesley. You can download right off their sites. You can use the search engine and search it, type in phrases to find things you're looking for. Let's see. Let me continue. What has been said applies perhaps in a special manner to the Western rather than the Eastern dispersion. So he's saying that there's a difference between East and West mindset, right? The connection of the latter, that's the Eastern, with Palestine was so close as to almost seem as one continuity. Because you got to remember, Babylon, the Babylonian synagogue, had tremendous influence over what happened in Jerusalem. That's where Hillel was based. He was a Babylonian, and he would make pronouncements, and they would literally go into Jerusalem. And they even said, our understanding, and you can look at this today, but the Babylonian Talmud is considered to be a more sacred document than the Jerusalem Talmud, because they considered themselves to be a more holy people than what was going on at Jerusalem with the temple, considering that the Sadducees had most influence over it, and they were more Hellenistic minded, and they didn't believe in the traditions of the rabbis. The Sadducees were what kind of like what you call the Karaites today, which is a people who they looked in the Torah and they said, okay, what does the Torah say? Then we'll do what the Torah says, and we'll make our own decisions about what it means. While the rabbis said, no, you can't do that. You have to let us tell you what it means, because we are the keepers of the oral Torah, which is the interpretation of what these laws actually mean. And that didn't go over well with the Sadducees, and needless to say, there was a political divide there. But the Sadducees had the most influence over what was going on in the temple, even though they, and I imagine they were the majority of the Sanhedrin too. So let's continue. So, the account of a truly representative gathering almost to seem as one continuity. In the account of a truly representative gathering in Jerusalem, on the ever memorable Feast of Weeks, we know what the Feast of Weeks is, right? Shavuot. The division of the dispersion into two grand sections, the Eastern, or the Trans-Euphratic, and the Western, or Hellenists, seems clearly marked. In this arrangement, the former would include the Parthians, the Medes, the Elamites, and the dwellers in Mesopotamia. Judea standing, so to speak, in the middle, while the Brits and the Arabians would typically represent the farthest outrunners, respectively, of the West and Eastern diaspora. The former, as we know from the New Testament, commonly bore in Palestine the name of the dispersion of the Greeks. And that's he got that from John 7:35. And of the Hellenists, or of the Grecians. On the other hand, the Trans-Euphratic Jews, who inhabited Babylon and many of the other satrapies, were included with the Palestinians and the Syrians under the term Hebrews, from the common tongue which they spoke. So he's saying basically that the people in the East, like I just mentioned, in Babylon, were basically considered to be Judeans, and the idea of they're living, well, strictly speaking, if you live in Babylon, you are not living in the inheritance, because the Babylon is on the east side of the Euphrates River. So, but I'm sure there were probably suburbs of Babylon or something that people were able to live in. They were probably outside the city walls, and you could be on the west side of the Euphrates. And it kind of gives you a perspective on how sad it really was when they went into captivity, because they were right on the border of the land of promise, but could not enter it. They could see it across the river, but they couldn't go to it without permission from the king. Nebuchadnezzar had to permit them to return, or to do something they wanted to do. To cross that river, you had to get special permission to travel, etc., etc. So it just goes to show you what a painful punishment it was to be exiled in Babylon, even though you got food and water and decent treatment, and Nebuchadnezzar just wanted you to be like his people. I mean, you remember we know about Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because Nebuchadnezzar brought those wise young men into his court and said, I'm going to train y'all to be my type of courtiers, my type of magicians, my type of astronomers, my type of astrologers, my type of soothsayers, so that you can learn all of our secrets, plus bring whatever it is that you guys did in your place, and y'all bring it all to serve me. But anyways, living in Babylon was a punishment, even though it was like being put out of the house. It's like if a husband said to his wife, "Get out of the house. You ain't sleeping here tonight." It's like, where am I supposed to go? He said, you can sit in the front yard, but you ain't coming in this house. You're not coming in. something has happened that's too bad. You ain't coming inside here. You're not going to pollute my home, but you can sit outside and see it and camp at it and watch it. All right, so the difference between the Grecians, that is to say Greece, and the Hebrews was far deeper than merely the language that they spoke, and extended to the whole direction of the way they thought. All right, and we talk a lot about this in the idea of Eastern versus Western thought, the idea of linear time versus looped circular time, the idea of a yin-yang balanced perspective on nature versus a straight line, we go and conquer and we make it what we want it to be, type of view of our responsibility to nature. The hard thing about, one of the hard things about dealing with, understanding things in a religious manner is you have to consider where you come from, and then you also have to consider where does what you're learning come from, because Israel's right in the middle of the world. It's the middle of the world. It is the border between the East and the West. The mindset of the people is different depending on if you go west from Jerusalem or if you go east from Jerusalem. In fact, it's commonly said that handwriting also goes that way. If you're from east of Jerusalem, you write right to left. If you're from west of Jerusalem, you write left to right, because it's a different type of mindset. All right, but here we go. The difference between the Greeks and the Hebrews, was more than just the language, and it extended to their whole direction of thought. There were mental influences at work in the Greek world, which, in the nature of things, it was impossible even for Jews to withdraw themselves, and which, indeed, were as necessary for the fulfillment of their mission as their isolation from heathenism and their connection with Jerusalem. At the same time, it was only natural that the Hellenists, placed as they were in the midst of such hostile elements, should intensely wish to be Jews, equal to their Eastern brethren. On the other hand, Pharisaism, in its pride and of its legal purity and its possession of the traditional lore, that's the oral Torah, with all that it had involved, made no secret of its contempt for the Hellenists, and openly declared the Greek far inferior to the Babylonian dispersion. That such feelings and suspicions which they engendered had struck deep into the popular mind appears from the fact that even in the apostolic church, and that in her earliest days, disputes could break out between the Hellenists and the Hebrews, arising from the suspicion of unkind or unfair dealings grounded in their sectional prejudices. And he refers to Acts 6, where it says, the Greeks were saying, hey, you're not paying for our widows. You're not helping the Greek widows, but you're helping the Eastern widows, and the idea of the East-West divide. There's the prejudices are being shown because the Pharisees taught Babylon's where the wisdom is, Jerusalem's where the temple is, everything west of Jerusalem is Greek. And there's a huge Jewish population in Egypt and Alexandria, but it's not an Egyptian city, it's a Greek city. It's just, it's named Alexandria. Obviously named for Alexander the Great. That was a place where, by the way, the Jews in Alexandria would go to Leontopolis in Egypt to make sacrifices. They didn't always go to Jerusalem, even though they'd send money there to support it. Literally, there was a Western temple and an Eastern temple, but he's probably not going to bring that up because that archaeological find wasn't really made until the early 1900s, and this book is written in the late 1800s. So, unfortunately for the people at the time, Jerusalem did not have a priesthood that was Aaronic, but Egypt did. Egypt had the priesthood of Aaron in the temple of Leontopolis, which is in the city of Heliopolis, which is the home of Joseph during the time of the Egyptian captivity. And right down the road from the Great Pyramids, by the way. It's in modern-day Cairo. All right, so let's see here. Far other was the estimate in which the Babylonians were held by the leaders of Judaism. Indeed, according to one view of it, Babylonia, as well as Syria, as far north as Antioch, was regarded as forming part of the land of Israel. Every other country was considered to be outside the land, as Palestine was called, with the exception of Babylonia, which was reckoned to be part of it. And he quotes the Talmud reference to that, but I'm not sure what that is. For Syria and Mesopotamia, eastwards to the banks of the Tigris, were supposed to have been in the territory which King David had conquered. This made them ideally forever like the land of Israel. But it was just between the Euphrates and the Tigris that the largest and wealthiest settlements of the Jews were, to such extent that a later writer actually designated them as, quote, the land of Israel. Here, Naharda and Nahar Malach, or the Royal Canal, which passed from the Euphrates to the Tigris, was the oldest Jewish settlement. It boasted a synagogue, said to have been built by King Jehoniah with stones that had been brought from the temple. It was a fortified city. The vast contributions intended for the temple were deposited there by the Eastern Jews, and thence conveyed to their destination under escorts of thousands of armed men. Another of these Jewish treasure cities was Nisibis in northern Mesopotamia. Even the fact, though, that wealth, which must have sorely tempted the cupidity of the heathen. In other words, you got these cities that are packed full of money and gold and treasure. He said it must have looked like a fine prize to any of those cities around them. Could be safely stored in these cities and then transported to Palestine. Shows how large that Jewish population must have been and how great their influence was. So he's saying just the fact that they didn't get invaded by the people that lived nearby them should let you know that not only were these cities wealthy and filled with people, they were capable of defending themselves, and even if they weren't necessarily enlisting their own men, they could afford mercenary armies to defend them if need be. All right. In general, it is of great importance to remember in regard to this eastern dispersion that only a minority of Jews, consisting of only about 50,000, originally returned from Babylon, first under Zerubbabel and afterwards under Ezra, and that's at about 537 BC, and then later in 459 BC. Nor was their inferiority confined to numbers. The wealthiest and most influential of Jews remained behind in Babylon because they were wealthy and powerful and didn't want to leave the cities that they were in. And Lord forgive me, don't think I'm anti-Semitic, but this was a complaint against the Jews before World War II started, is they didn't want to return to Israel, even though the Balfour Declaration had been declared that Palestine was to be a land for the Jews. A lot of them just didn't want to go back because they had homes and they had lands and they had influence and positions of power in the cities of Europe. They didn't want to return to Israel, even though, remember, every year at Passover it is said, next year in Jerusalem, because that is supposed to be what is in the heart of the Jew, is to return to the land and return to the temple and return to the place that God had set apart. All right, let's continue here. According to Josephus in his Antiquities, book 1152, and with whom Philo substantially agreed, vast numbers, estimated at millions, inhabited the trans-Euphratic provinces, to judge even by the number of those slain in popular uprisings, 50,000 in Seleucia alone. These figures do not seem greatly exaggerated. A later tradition had it that so dense was the Jewish population in the Persian Empire that Cyrus forbade the further return of exiles lest his country should become depopulated. So large and compact a body soon became a political power. Kindly treated under the Persian monarchy, there were, after the fall of that empire in 330 BC, favored by the successors of Alexander, when in turn the Macedono-Syrian rule gave place to the Parthian Empire in 63 BC. The Jews formed from their national opposition to Rome an important element in the East. Such was their influence that, as late as the year 40 A.D., the Roman legate shrank from provoking their hostility. At the same time, it must not be thought that, even in these favored regimes, there were wholly without persecution. Here also history records more than one tale of bloody strife on the part of those among whom they dwelt. So he's saying that even though, yes, they had a lot of they had political power, they had large numbers of people. When he says trans-Euphrates, he means from the Euphrates River over into Jerusalem. The whole area was full of Jews. There was people living all over, and that's the land of the inheritance. But these all were places that had formerly been, the lands of different empires. Babylon's empire, and then Persia's empire, and then Greece's empire. And now the Romans are moving around and getting land grabs going on in the area. And remember, everything is not directly ruled. Some places are vassal states, some places are just, tax collection points, and basically you pay your protection money to the Romans, and they'll keep their army nearby to keep marauders down and all that kind of stuff. There's different ways that different governments dealt with the Roman Empire. To the Palestinians, their brethren to the east and of Syria, to which they had wandered under the fostering role of the Macedon-Syrian monarchs, that is to say the Seleucids, that's Antiochus's group, were indeed preeminently the Golad, or dispersion. To them the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem intimated by fire signals from the mountaintop to mountaintop the commencement of each month for the regulation of the festive calendar, even as they afterwards dispatched messengers unto Syria for the same purpose. And he quotes the Talmudic document there. In some respects, the eastern dispersion was placed on the same footing. In others, on even a higher level than the mother country. Tithes and the teramoth, or the first fruits, in a prepared condition, were due from them, while the bikurim, or the first fruits, in a fresh state, were to be brought from Syria to Jerusalem. Unlike the heathen countries, whose very dust defiled the soil of Syria, was declared clean. Like Palestine itself, so far as purity of descent was concerned, the Babylonians, indeed, considered themselves superior to their Palestinian brethren. They had it that when Ezra took with him those who went to Palestine, he had left the land behind him as pure as fine flour. To express it in their own fashion, in regard to the genealogical purity of their Jewish inhabitants, all other countries were, compared to Palestine, like dough that had been mixed with leaven. And again, these are Talmudic oral Torah. And you remember, Yeshua used that term. He said, beware the leavening of the Pharisees. But Palestine itself was such by the side of Babylon. It was even maintained that the exact boundaries could be traced in a district within which the Jewish population had preserved itself unmixed. Great merit was in this respect also ascribed to Ezra. In the usual mode of exaggeration, it was asserted that, if all the genealogical studies and researchers had been put together, they would have amounted to many 100 camel loads. There was for it, however, at least this foundation in truth, that great care and labor were bestowed on preserving full and accurate records so as to establish purity of descent. With importance attached to it, we know the actions of Ezra in this respect, and from the stress which Josephus lays on this point in his Life of the Jews. Official records of descent as regard the priesthood were kept in the temple. Besides, the Jewish authorities seem to have possessed a general official register, which Herod afterward ordered burnt, from reasons which it is not too difficult to infer. But from that day, laments a rabbi, quote, the glory of the Jews has been decreased. It was very important who your lineage came from. There were accurate, detailed records of birth records, which, I mean, we still have birth records today, but we don't put as much, as much behind them, except in terms of inheritance, I guess. But he's literally saying, Herod ordered the temple documents on genealogy burned because people kept saying that Herod wasn't Jewish. And he says, well, now you can't prove you are either. So he had all that stuff burned. And some may even say that that is what's being referred to in the New Testament. It says that the Herod had all the young children killed. In a certain sense, if you look at the burning of the documents that told who your parents were, who your grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, all the way back to Abraham, if those documents were burned, you couldn't even prove who you were. So in a certain sense, it did kill you in terms of inheritance, in terms of you being able to be someone. And even nowadays, modern Jewish rabbis, they'll say it doesn't matter if your last name's, Einstein. Was your mother Jewish? If your mother wasn't a practicing Jew, you're not Jewish. It doesn't matter, what the DNA test says or anything like that. You have to have a direct, provable line that didn't stop before you got here. All right, so let's move on. Nor was it merely purity of descent of which the Eastern dispersion could boast. In truth, Palestine owed everything to Ezra, the Babylonian, a man so distinguished that according to tradition, the law would have been given by him if Moses had not previously obtained that honor. Putting aside the various traditional ordinances which the Talmud ascribes to him, we know that from scriptures what his activity for good had been. Altered circumstances have been brought many changes to the new Jewish state. Even the language, spoken and written, was other than formerly. Instead of the characters anciently employed, the exiles brought with them, on their return, those now common, so-called square Hebrew letters, which gradually came into general use. And this is quoted from the Sanhedrin 21b. The language spoken by the Jews was no longer Hebrew, but Aramaean, both in Palestine and Babylonia, in the former the Western, and in the latter the Eastern dialect. So there was two different dialects of Aramaic, because Aramaic is the language of Babylon. That's the language of Nebuchadnezzar. So he takes them in for 70 years, and of course a whole generation's born there. And the language they come up here in is a language that the people speak, right? The language that people speak is Aramaic. It's similar to Hebrew. It's very similar to Hebrew. It's more complex than Hebrew is. So the holy language is still Hebrew. The Torah is written in Hebrew, but of course they brought with them the new Babylonian block characters. They weren't using those old Paleo-Hebrew symbols or anything like that anymore. They're using a new form of lettering which comes from the Babylonians. Let's see. In fact, the common people were ignorant of pure Hebrew, which henceforth became the language of the student and of the synagogue. So if you went to a synagogue, you needed to be able to learn to speak Hebrew, or when the Torah was read, you wouldn't know what was being said. But don't worry, because a rabbi would give you the interpretation of what was being said in Aramaic so that you would know what it meant. So even if you could understand Hebrew, it didn't matter what you understood, because you weren't privy to understand the mysteries of the Torah. And this is exactly why when Yeshua says, if you call your brother, if you're angry with your brother, you can go up for judgment. If you call your brother Rakah, you can be brought before the Sanhedrin for it. He said, but if you call a brother a fool, then you deserve hellfire. And of course, that's not where the devil lives, hellfire. That's Gehinnom, is the valley of Hinnom, where the trash was burned. So he's basically saying you're a trash person if you tell somebody else that they are moros. The Greek word is moros, which comes from the word mysterion in the Greek, mysterion is the secret knowledge that only the Pharisees had. So he said, if you tell somebody that they don't understand God because they are not a Pharisee, you are a trash person who deserves to be burned out with the rest of the garbage. So everybody out there is afraid to call somebody F-O-O-L. Don't worry, it's probably no worse than being mean to anybody else in any ways bad. All right, so let's see here. Even there, and this is a big word, methurgamon, or an interpreter, here this is what I was talking about, had been employed, talking about inside the synagogue while the Torah is being read in Hebrew. And this is the word for it, a methurgamon, or an interpreter had to be employed to translate into the vernacular the portions of Scripture read in the public services. And he quotes this, and he points out that this may relate to something that Paul said. Let me read you the footnote. It said, could St. Paul have had this in mind when, in referring to the miraculous gift of speaking in other languages, he directs that one shall always interpret? This is 1 Corinthians, right? At any rate, the word targum in Ezra 4:7 is rendered in the Septuagint by, and he has the Greek word here, but I don't know what it is. The following from the Talmud affords a curious illustration of 1 Corinthians. It says, and this is quoted in the Talmud, it says, quote, let a man always finish his parashah, that is the daily lesson from the law, with the congregation at some times, twice the text, and once from the Targum. So read it out loud twice in Hebrew, and then you have your interpreter, because the Targum was a translation of the Hebrew into another language, typically Aramaic. In fact, there were some points where it was considered illegal for a person to have a Targum, and I'd have to look up some, but there were rabbis who got in trouble for having Targums because it was considered, and honestly, I think this is probably just mirroring the same thing it is for modern day Islam. In Islam, the Quran is to be kept in Arabic. If you read the Quran and it's not in Arabic, they're going to say you're polluting it. You don't understand what it means because you're not reading it in the original holy tongue, the Arabic. Same idea with the Torah. If you're not reading in the original holy tongue, the Hebrew, then you're not going to be able to understand it, which I honestly agree with, because there is so much more in the Hebrew language than there is otherwise. There's so much they say there's 4 different levels of interpretation. Best we can hope for is the outer level when we read it in English, and who knows, maybe we can pick up on some patterns and similarities between things. But if you actually know Hebrew, and then if you actually learn the gematria, I mean, there's guys that study it by adding up words. They're literally, every word, they just add up the meanings of the words and then compare them to other words with the same meanings and draw completely new conclusions from that method of study. And I can't verify if that's good or not, but I can tell you that I know of an Orthodox Jew named Ariel Cohen Alera, who purely on his own study in the gematria decided that Yeshua was indeed the Messiah, because everything about him added up to the right numbers in gematria. All right, so let's continue here. All right, so let's see. The Scripture is read in public services and addresses, and the address is delivered by the rabbi. So the rabbi, there would be an interpreter to make sure you knew exactly what the rabbi said. This was the origin of the so-called Targumim, or paraphrases of the Scripture. In earliest times, indeed, it was forbidden for the Methurgamon to read his translation or to write down a Targum, lest the paraphrase should be regarded as of equal authority with the original. It was said that, when Jonathan brought out his Targum on the prophets, a voice from heaven was heard to utter, quote, "Who is this that has revealed my secrets to men?" And this is a Megil 3. I'm assuming that's a Talmudic writing. I don't know. Still, such a Targumim seems to have existed from a very early period, and amid the varying and often incorrect renderings, their necessity must have made it itself increasingly felt. Accordingly, their use was authoritative and sanctioned before the end of the 2nd century after Christ. This is the origin of our 2 oldest extant Targumim, that of the Onklios, as it is called, and on the Pentateuch, and the other is on the prophets attributed to Jonathan, the son of Uzziel. These names do not indeed accurately represent the authorship of the oldest Targumim, which may more correctly be regarded as later and authoritative recensions of what in some form had existed before. But although these works had their origin in Palestine, it is noteworthy that, in the form which at present we possess them, they are the outcome of the schools of Babylon. So the Targumim is an early, would you call it an early Mishnah? I'm not exactly sure what they call it, but among the Pharisees, they passed information down mouth to mouth, just as Moses had been given his inspiration from Yehovah mouth to mouth, right? So the Pharisee teacher would teach his children, or not, I shouldn't say children, his Talmudim. He would, which is where Talmud comes from, right? He would teach his Talmudim the secrets that are reserved for those who truly seek to know the depth of the Torah. You know, not just the simple, not simply just the mitzvot, not just following the commandments, but understanding the deeper metaphysical, quote unquote, as they say in the church, the spirit-filled understanding, right, of what was being said in the scripture, and then not just the scripture, but the oral Torah as well. So if someone was writing down what these Pharisees were saying, they would say, no, you don't do that. Don't write it down, because it's to be passed from teacher to student. It's not to be written down. And of course, eventually, they write down the Mishnah, which is this kind of information. And then, you know, modern rabbis will say, oh, it's so unfortunate that the Mishnah was written down, because now that document it's a dead document. It can't grow and change anymore. All you're just stuck with whatever came from the past, and there's no way to have a modern, you know, adding to or taking away from the meaning of what it is. And I say that with a touch of sarcasm, because I mean, aren't we supposed to avoid adding to or taking away from? But when you have an oral tradition, that's kind of the point. You're going to add to it and take away from it all the time. All right. Have you ever played a telephone game where you whisper in somebody's ear something, and then they whisper to somebody, and 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 then it comes back around to you, and you're like, that is not at all what I just said. But because people hear things, they change things, and needless to say. Let us continue. And it was said that, but in Palestine owed, if possible, a greater debt to Babylon. The new circumstances in which Jews were placed on their return seemed to render necessary an adaptation of the Mosaic law, if not new legislation. Besides, piety and zeal now attach themselves to the outward observance and the study of the letter of the law. This is the origin of the Mishnah, or the second law. I should just read this because I keep bringing these things up before they get to, which was intended to explain and supplement the first. This constituted the only Jewish dogmatics in the real sense, in the study of which the sage, rabbi, scholar, and scribe, darshan, were engaged. The result of it was the midrash, or investigation, a term which afterwards was popularly applied to the commentaries on scripture and preaching. From the outset, Jewish theology divided into two different branches, that is the Halacha and the Haggadah. The former, which is the Halacha, to go, was to speak the rule of the spiritual road. So the Halacha is to walk. Halakha is walk, right? So Yehovah halakha with Adam in the garden, right? He walked with Adam. So as he's walking with Adam, he's teaching Adam how to walk straight, walk upright, and walk the proper paths. So that's the idea of that the Pharisee rabbi would teach you how to walk the spiritual road properly. And when fixed, had an even greater authority than the Old Testament scripture itself, since it explained and applied to them. Okay, this is why you see when Yeshua and his disciples are in the field plucking grain with their hands and eating it, the Pharisees say, wait, you're violating the Sabbath. That's against the law. It's not against the law in the Torah. It's against the halakha, which is the instructions of the Pharisees, that is to say, the fence that they had built around the Torah to make sure you couldn't even possibly violate it. It literally states in the Torah that you can harvest fields on the you can pick grain as long as you don't use an implement to harvest it on the Sabbath, and it's not a problem. But it was a problem for the halakha of the Pharisees, which is why he literally spout right back out at them. Well, then why don't you probably think that the priest is violating the Sabbath right now when he's doing the duty that's his job. I mean, he's doing exactly what he's instructed by the Most High to do. All right. And on the other hand, The Haggadah, from the word nagad, to tell, was only the personal sayings of a teacher, more or less valuable according to his learning and his popularity, or the authorities which he could quote in his support. Unlike the Halacha and Haggadah unlike the Halacha, which is the walk, the Haggadah did not have absolute authority, either as a doctrine or a practice or an exegesis, but all the greater would be its popular influence, and all the more dangerous the doctrinal license which it allowed. So he's saying the problem with letting your teacher tell you what something means instead of taking the time to come to an understanding on your own is that it allows them to mold and manipulate the way you see the God that you were supposedly wanting to become at one with. Isn't the idea that he would marry us, or at least make a covenant with us, that he would take us in as his own children into his own house? Well, if you let a teacher, a pastor, whatever you want to call them, a rabbi, a priest, tell you what things mean long enough, they can control the way you interact with your God. In fact, strange as it may sound, almost all the doctrinal teachings of the synagogue is to be derived from the Haggadah. And this also is characteristic of Jewish traditionalism. But, alike in Halakha and the Haggadah, Palestine was under the deepest obligation to Babylonia. For the father of the Halakha study was Hillel, the Babylonian, and among the popular Haggadists, there was no better known name than that of Eleazar the Mede, who flourished in the 1st century of our era. After this, it seemed almost idle to inquire whether, during the first period after the return of the exiles from Babylon, there were regular theological academies in Babylon. Those are the synagogues. They already had doctrinal, dogmatic teaching schools that taught you how to be Jewish in Babylon. Although it is, of course, impossible to furnish historical proof, we can scarcely doubt that a community so large and so intensely Hebrew would not have been indifferent to that study which constituted the main thought and engagement of their brethren in Palestine. We can understand that. And imagine it like this. You're an intelligent, believing person. You've been pulled into captivity. You've been told by the prophets it's because of what you did, what your kings did. And you're like, well, the temple's gone. There's nothing. I can't go back to it. I don't know when this is going to end. I will become the holiness of God on the earth. And this is what Pharisee means. It means to be the set apart ones. So I will become the royal priesthood that was described at Sinai. I will live my life like a royal priest, which is, again, the idea of being a Pharisee. So he's saying that it's no surprise that when these people ended up in Babylon, they had to create their own school, new ways of being a religious Hebrew person, because that they couldn't get to the temple. I was gone. Temple's gone. Can't go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's got a hole in the wall. Babylonians took you into captivity. You're slaves to Nebuchadnezzar, as clearly stated by your own prophets. So you now have to figure out a way to dwell in the righteousness of God. And this is what modern conservative Jews will tell you, is that their righteousness is bulls of their lips, prayers, and then charitable giving to different organizations. For instance, in the conservative Jewish synagogue, you'll be taught you have to give at least 10% of your earnings to charity, minimum. If you don't do that, God's going to get mad at you and come after you. If you give 20%, He's going to bless you for what you're doing. 10%, no blessing, but you don't make Him mad. 20%, you make Him happy, you get a blessing, because you're meeting your obligation as a priest in that sense. All right, let's see here. Hillel, the Babylonian, right? After this, it seems almost idle to inquire. So large and intensely Hebrew population, one must have had their own schools. We can understand that, since the great Sanhedrin in Palestine exercised supreme spiritual authority. Didn't turn off my notifications. I did turn off my notifications. Where's that coming from? We can understand that since the great Sanhedrin in Palestine exercised supreme spiritual authority in that capacity, ultimately settled all religious questions, at least for a time. The study and discussion of these subjects should have been chiefly carried out in the schools of Palestine, and that even the great Hillel himself, when still a poor and unknown student, should have wandered thither, that is to say, to Palestine, or Jerusalem, right, to acquire the learning and authority which at that period he could not have found in his own country. But even this circumstance implies that such studies were at least carried on and encouraged in Babylonia. How rapidly soon afterward the authority of the Babylonian schools increased, till they not only overshadowed those of Palestine, but finally inherited their prerogatives, as is well known. However, therefore, the Palestinians, in their pride or jealousy, might sneer, and he's cited this, that the Babylonians were stupid, proud, and poor. They ate bread upon bread. Even they had to acknowledge that, quote, when the law had fallen into oblivion, it was restored by Ezra of Babylon. When it was a second time forgotten, it was Hillel the Babylonian who came and recovered it. And when yet a third time it fell into oblivion, Rabbi Shihah came from Babylon and gave it back once more. So these are all quotes from Talmudic sources. Let me see if I can give you the citation. Yes, it is from the Talmud, page 323, and unfortunately I couldn't tell you which book of the Talmud that's in. But he has cited it here if you actually want to look up the work. Such then was the Hebrew dispersion, which from the first constituted really the chief part and the strength of the Jewish nation, and with which its religious future was also to lie. For it is one of those strangely significant, almost symbolic facts in history, that after the destruction of Jerusalem, the spiritual supremacy of Palestine passed to Babylonia, and that to rabbinic Judaism, under the stress of political adversity, voluntarily transferred itself to the seat of Israel's ancient dispersion, as if to ratify by its own act what the judgment of God had formerly executed. But long before that time, the Babylonian dispersion had already stretched out its hand in every direction. Northwards it spread through Armenia, through the Caucasus Mountains, and to the shores of the Black Sea, and through Media to those of the Caspians. Southwards it extended to the Gulf of Persia, and through the vast extent of Arabia, although Arabia Felix and the land of the Homerites may have received their first Jewish colonies from the opposite shores of Ethiopia. Eastwards it had passed as far as India. Everywhere we have distinct notices of these wanderers, and everywhere they appear as in closest connection with the rabbinical hierarchy of Palestine. Thus the Mishnah, in its extremely curious section, and he quotes the section here, signifies it as being, let's see, it says the footnote, the whole section gives a most curious glimpse of the dress and adornments worn by the Jews at the time. The reader interested in the subject volumes will find information of the 3 volumes of Hartmann, of Schroeder, and the somewhat heavy work in some German name here. And he mentions several authors that have written on the subject. Now let's see what he says here. That these works tell us how, on Sabbaths, the Jewesses of Arabia might wear their long veils, while those in India would only wear a kerchief around their head, customary in those countries, without incurring the guilt of desecrating the holy day by needlessly carrying on what, in the eyes of the law, would be a burden. That is to say, you can't do your makeup and fix your hair on the Sabbath, according to the Halacha, because that's a waste, and that's work you don't need to be doing. But these women were allowed to wear their veils and to wrap their heads in a handkerchief, depending on what nation they were in. While in the rubric of the Day of Atonement, that's Yom Kippur, we have it noted that the dress which was the high priest wore between the evenings of the great fast, that is, as afternoon darkened into evening, was of the most costly Indian stuff. And that's Indian stuff. And that's in Yoma 3:7. Then among such vast a community there should have been poverty, and that at one time, as the Palestinians had sneered, learning may have been left to pine in want. We can readily believe, for as one of the rabbis had in an explanation of Deuteronomy 30:13, quote, "Wisdom is not beyond the sea." That is, it will not be found among the traders or merchants, and then he quotes the rabbinical work, whose mind must be engrossed by grain, and it was trade and commerce which procured to the Babylonians their wealth and influence. Although agriculture was not neglected, their caravans, of whose camel drivers, by the way, no very flattering account is given, and he quotes the Kiddush 4:14 on that one, carried the rich carpets and woven stuffs of the east, as well as the precious spices to the west, generally through Palestine to Phoenician harbors, where a fleet of merchantmen belonging to Jewish bankers and shippers lay ready to convey them to every quarter of the world. These merchant princes were keenly alive to all that had passed, not only in the financial but in the political world. We know that they were in possession of state secrets and entrusted with the intricacies of diplomacy. Yet whatever its condition, this Eastern Jewish community was intensely Hebrew. Only 8 days' journey, though, according to Philo's Western idea of it, by a difficult road, separated them from Palestine, and every pulsation there vibrated in Babylonia. It was in the most outlying part of the colony, in the wide plains of Arabia, that Saul of Tarsus spent those 3 years of silent thought and unknown labor which preceded his reappearance in Jerusalem. That's the Apostle Paul, for people that don't know who Shaul is. That's the Apostle Paul. His name was Shaul. It was never changed to Paul. It was always Shaul. But it got changed in the scripture, so we'd know that there was a difference between the guys. His reappearance in Jerusalem, when from burning longing to labor among his brethren, kindled by long residence among these Hebrews of Hebrews, he was directed to that strange work which was his life mission, according to Galatians 1:17. And it was among the same community that Peter wrote and labored, 1 Peter 5:13, amidst disagreements of which we can form some conception from the sad boast of Naharda, that up to the end of the 3rd century it had not been numbered among its members any converts to Christianity. So this area that he's mentioning here that Paul was in, according to the rabbinical writings, boasted that all the Jews in that region stayed Jews, that none of them become Christians, even though the Apostle Peter was there, even though Paul the Pharisee was there, even though we would say those men were Christians. Apparently, in the eyes of the Jews, they were not. They were Jewish men, understanding Jewish things. Yes? Hold on, I got somebody at the door. Look at an hour. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. Just put it on your phone. Oh, one of the problems having a DSL connection is streaming video tends to clog it up. Let's see. In what had been said, no notice had been taken of those wanderers of the 10 tribes, whose trackless footsteps seem as mysterious as their after fate. The Talmudists name 4 countries as their seats, but even if it were to attach historic credence to their vague statements, at least 2 of these localities cannot with any certainty be identified. Only thus far all agree as to point us northwards through India, through Armenia, the Kurdish mountains, and into the Caucasus, and with this tallies a curious reference in what is known as the 4th of the Esdras, which locates them in the land that they call Arzarath, a term which has with some probability been identified as the land of Ararat in Josephus's Antiquities, and describes them as an innumerable multitude and vaguely locates them beyond the Euphrates. The Mishnah is silent as far as their seats, but discusses their future restoration, Rabbi Akiva denying and Rabbi Eliezer anticipating it, according to Sanhedrin 10:3. Another Jewish tradition locates them by the fabled river of the Sabbaton, which was supposed to cease its flow on the weekly Sabbath. This, of course, is an implied admission of ignorance of their seats. Similarly, the Talmud in the Jerusalem Sanhedrin, tract 29c, speaks of these three localities whither they had been banished: the district around the river of the Sabbaton, Daphne, near Antioch, while the third was overshadowed and hidden by a cloud. All right. Later Jewish notices connect the final discovery and the return of the, quote, lost tribes with their conversion under that second Messiah, who, in contradiction to, quote, the son of David, is stylized as the son of Joseph. And this, of course, if you're keeping up, Messiah ben David versus Messiah ben Joseph. Joseph, dressed in the garb of the Pharaoh, is unidentifiable by his Hebrew brothers. Messiah ben David is a conquering king, to whom Jewish tradition ascribes what it cannot reconcile with the royal dignity of the son of David, which, if applied to him, would almost inevitably lead up to the most wide concessions into the Christian argument. As regards the 10 tribes, there is this truth underlying the strange hypothesis that, as their persistent apostasy from the God of Israel and his worship had cut them off from his people, so the fulfillment of the divine promise to them in the latter days would imply, as it were, a second birth to make them once more Israel. Beyond this, we are traveling chiefly into the region of conjecture. Modern investigations have pointed to the Nestorians, and laterally, with the almost convincing evidence, so far as much as possible, to the Afghans as descended from these lost tribes. Such mixture with and lapse into the Gentile nationality seems to have been before the minds of those rabbis who ordered that, if at present a non-Jew weds a Jewess, such a union was to be respected, since the stranger might be a descendant of the 10 tribes. This is from Yebam 6:19. Besides, there is a reason to believe that part of them, at least, had coalesced with their brethren of the later exile. This is Kaddish 69b. While we know that individuals who had settled in Palestine and presumably elsewhere were able to trace descent from them, still the great mass of the 10 tribes was in the days of Christ, as it is on our own, lost as a Hebrew nation. And that's the end of chapter 1. So this book is written in the 1800s. And he's saying the 10 tribes are lost, but through Yeshua, they will return. And then he quotes from the Talmud to show you that rabbinical scholars have said exactly that same thing. That at some point, these 10 tribes, the stick of Judah and Ephraim, is going to have to be rejoined together. And like I said, he quotes the rabbinical sources that say exactly the same thing. Now, unfortunately, there's modern rabbis who say, oh, there's no such thing as 10 lost tribes anymore because Babylon conquered Assyria, and the Jews that Assyria had taken captive were all brought to Babylon, which is, I'm sure there were some that were brought to Babylon, but I don't see why he would think that every person who had been pulled into captivity by the Assyrians, sold and dispersed throughout the world. I mean, looking at Isaiah, Jehovah said he was going to disperse them to the nations, that his name would get glory. That was the idea. And then one day, when his glory was established among the nations themselves would send the Hebrew people back to the land. It would literally force them to return to the land, so that they could be his people again. They could be that royal priesthood that he wanted from the beginning. So that's the conclusion of chapter 1. He's given us an intro into understanding what was going on politically and religiously at the time of the Second Temple, post Maccabean, post Hasmonean, right at the time of Augustus Caesar, and then even a little farther into where our understanding of this history comes from, which is from writings that are in the Talmud and in the Mishnah and in the Targum, different religious works that were codified from the oral history and written down, and that we're finding these things out. Nehemiah Gordon said in a recent video I watched that most people that study the Talmud actually really only study about 20% of it. And of course that's the 20% that backs what they've already been taught that they should tell Jews about being Jews. Probably the part that says that the New Testament is a book on how to kill Jews, which I have literally seen people testify to on One for Israel on YouTube. People who were raised Jewish, who were told by rabbis not that they may never read the New Testament because it is a book on how to kill Jews, which is obviously an exaggeration, even if it was in any way true, which it's not. It's a book about being Jewish with the Messiah teaching you. It's not a new religion. It's not a reason to kill Jews. And I think that this man from the 1800s would probably agree with our modern understanding. Unfortunately, he's just one scholar in a world full of religious dogma. He's an Anglican, which means he's part of the Anglican Church, which was the Church of England, which was in direct opposition to the Catholic Church. The Anglican Church, unfortunately, the modern Anglican Church is now currently under Catholicism. It has returned, which is exactly what the Catholic Church said would happen. The Catholic Church said the Protestant churches are a rebellion that will end, and the daughter churches of the mother church will return to her. And I must say that they have accurately prophesied that one, because it's happening. With the signing of a 501c3, any church that does that, when they become a co-entity that exists as a state-born entity, they have literally rejoined the Holy Roman Empire, which is the Catholic Church, and have taken to following its rules and its recommendations and its laws, and have made it the head. Christ is no longer the head of that church, but the government is the head of the church, which is why the government has every right to come in and, bust heads when the pastor says, God doesn't want you to be gay, and they can say, oh, you're going to jail, buddy, because you broke the law. And then that man did break the law, because a man that's a pastor over a 501c3 church signed on the dotted line that he agreed with the state that the state should be the head of that entity, which is a corporation. But like I said, that's a whole other ball of wax. But I'll try to hit chapter 2 up tomorrow if I can. If I can get enough internet signal, my family don't get mad at me for hogging all the internet. But I just want to thank everybody who will watch this or commented on it or is going to watch it in the future. I just want to say, be blessed and keep seeking. I love these books that are written, 100, 150 years ago, because it was a time when people, the printing press was available, libraries were available, but people weren't distracted by television or the radio or now the cell phone and the internet. When a man dedicated his life to something, like it would write a book like that, you're a PhD level professor at a place that has a big library, and you literally just live in that library and do nothing but that. And I like reading those kind of works because I respect people that really put the time and the effort into what they do. That's a lesson that I think that Yehovah has been teaching me. I've always been the kind of person I could get by the skin of my teeth. I passed all my classes in school. I never studied. I got my degree in college. I never did homework, never studied. Now I've come to the point where if I want to progress with him, I have to study. I have to put forth time and effort. So I appreciate people who put forth time and effort to show him the respect that he deserves, because he is more than just, some people are like, well, the Spirit will guide me, the Spirit will guide me. And I'm not saying it won't at first, but sooner or later you're going to have to crucify that flesh, and you're going to have to do that thing that's hard. For some people, I don't think they're going to be used that way, because for some people they're very studious and they don't have a problem sitting down and studying, and turning that ADHD around and doing the book work. I've been someone who's never been able to do book work, so that's part of the reason I put this up. It's because I'm reading this book as much for me as I'm reading it to share it with you guys and discuss it, because it's big, it's dense. Oh gosh, let me see how many pages it is. This is a 1,000-page. Let's see. The book itself is 922 pages. It contains almost 200 pages of indexes and addendums to help. It's got word definitions and just research tools. This is the kind of book that, a person who wants to take that step into the scholarly study, to not just believe whatever's told to them, to not just blindly follow. We have to be like the Bereans. We can't get by on blindly following. If you really think that you can, then I suggest you become Jewish, because the rabbis will tell you, if you simply do what the rabbi says, you will never be held to fault, because you obeyed the rabbi. If you obey the rabbi, they can make all the decisions for you. You will never make a mistake, because even if you make a mistake, it's their fault, not your fault. For me, I don't find that to be a relationship that I'm willing to have, because that's the relationship that I have with my wife. The relationship is, if I'm going to be priest of the household, the only entity that should be responsible for me is Yeshua. That's it. I'm a slave in his house. I got my wife. I take care of my wife and my children, and I accept responsibility for what they do. And that's the essence of being a king, is assuming liability. Beyond that, I hope he'll train me to be a good man that can make the acceptable sacrifice, which would be the essence of being a priest. So again, thank you for watching. I'll try to get chapter 2 up. Be blessed, and shalom. May the peace that only God can put in your heart rest in it. And may the day come when we can say Baruch Abba Yahuwah. Some people say Baruch Abba Hashem, and I say Baruch Abba Yahuwah, when we can say out loud, without fear of retribution, be blessed in the name of Yahuwah. All right. Thank you again.